Now, if you then say the people who inherit any aspect of that wealth then are complicit in the original sin, they do not deserve that portion of the wealth. And to the extent that they have that wealth, they should be feeling guilty. A lot of these positions do have historical roots. And in most cases, each of us is working within a philosophical tradition or living within a philosophical tradition, whether we realize it or not. We absorb it sometimes uncritically when we are kids. And they have studied not only all of the important arguments in philosophy, but they have studied the history. And all of them are saying the modern world is based on false assumptions.
Hello, sir.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Thank you for coming on my podcast.
Pleasure.
Maybe you could just introduce yourself for my guests and say what it is that you do and how long you've been doing it for.
Well, I'm a professor of philosophy at Rockford University in Illinois, Chicagoland. We come out of the liberal arts tradition. It's a private institution, so we give our students a good general, wide-ranging education, small classes, lots of access to the professors. My intellectual interests have been in the intellectual history, how ideas develop over time. So in many cases, I'm interested in contemporary issues, but how the contemporary issue came to be framed and the debates and positions on various sides themselves have a history. And in many cases, it's illuminating to see, because sometimes we think in a box to see how we got into that box historically, and that sometimes enables us to step outside the box and see what other alternatives are. I'm originally from Canada, born in Toronto, did my undergraduate at Guelph, just down the road from Toronto, and then came to the States for my graduate degree and ended up getting my university position here, and I've been here ever since.
Well, you're not that far over the border. Chicago's pretty close.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You're a northerner still. You still get snow.
Right. Yes, that's right. And it is the Windy City. It's aptly named. There's a noticeable uptick weather-wise.
We have a wonderful painting. An old friend of ours painted the railway tracks before they built over them in Chicago. And he's a real super realist. So everything is, you can see every stone, you know, I mean, it's very, very detailed. But it's just this great train engine coming down the tracks. And then you can see the tracks going off in the distance and you can see the city beyond. But now, of course, you go to Chicago and it's all underneath these huge buildings.
Sure, yes, right.
So,
yeah, I do like some of those paintings that are from the romantic golden age of trains. There's something majestic about them.
Yeah. Well, I grew up, my dad was a telegrapher on the railway when I was a baby. And so we lived in a train station and played on the train tracks before they closed the Alberta Railway. And then he, you know, got a different job. So my grandfather was a relief agent. So my dad just started doing that when he left high school. And so he moved around Northern Alberta for quite a while until he had 4 kids. And then the Alberta Railway closed up and he, you know, bought a business in real estate and insurance. And that was the end of but so trains, I can remember the cabooses. I can remember those beaters that you would move up and down the tracks with by, it would have a lever that you could push from side to side and it would make the little beater go. It was just an open flatbed that you could roll down the tracks with. Anyway, so I like the railway and the trains and all of that. It brings back good memories of the freedom of being a child before you had to think up philosophical thought.
Being a free-range kid, as the expression is.
Yeah. And in Chicago, that would be the case. So I thought we would start by giving a definition between the difference between capitalism and socialism, because we're still in the middle of believing that socialism is a good idea for some reason. So if you could do that for us.
Yeah. Well, the modern history, I'm just going to go back, a couple of hundred years, and why this is still a framing issue for how we think about culture and politics is, say, in the 1700s. So the old feudal regimes are declining. In some cases, in more revolutionary fashion, they're being kicked out of existence. But ingrained in human beings as a result of feudalism had been this notion of hierarchy, that there was a natural or perhaps a divinely ordained social hierarchy, and that political culture should reflect that. And then in most stylized form, you would have the king at the top, and then you would have the aristocrats, and then all the way down the pecking order, so to speak. So all of that is being exploded in the modern world. And then by the time we get into the 1700s, the question then is, what are we going to replace that with? And the two modern answers to get rid of hierarchy as a fundamental political value are liberty and equality. And the capitalism and socialism debates come out of that. So what we find is that the capitalist side is going to say the problem with hierarchy basically is that people are not free, right? It restricts people's liberty. You are in a class, and whom you can marry, who you can be friends with, what you can wear as clothing even is determined by your place in the hierarchy. And so the one answer then is to say people should be free in all respects. So serfs should be free to leave the land. We shouldn't have slavery anymore. Women should be free to get educated, have their own bank accounts. And so there's this universalistic notion of freedom. And that then comes out in economic form, that people should be free to make whatever they want, to trade with whomever they want, and consume whatever they want. And so capitalism then is nested within this broader commitment to freedom. Now, there is a notion of equality there, but the idea here is that people should be equal politically. That there should be the same rules or the same laws for everybody. But in all other respects, capitalists are perfectly comfortable with inequalities. You're free to make your own choices and find your own level in society and so on. Now, the other side of the divide, though, wants to say feudalism with its hierarchical structure is wrong. But what fundamentally is wrong with it is that people are not equal. So you have unequal social statuses. And so what we need to do is make people robustly equal across all social dimensions. And so they're going to prioritize certain forms of equality. And they're then going to say liberty is an important value, but it's a less important value than equality. First, we need to make people in all social dimensions, not just economic dimensions, but also in terms of status, equal. And then within that equal framework, there will be some liberties that are going to be allowed. So that is the debate that we've been having in very abstract form. Both sides are recognizing hierarchy is going to be out politically, but are we going to replace it with liberty, and then people will end up wherever they end up as a result of free action and free interchange? Or are we going to first try to make everybody equal and then allow perhaps some freedoms within that egalitarian framework? Now, the big battle of the 20th century, which was partly hot wars and partly cold wars, tended to focus on the economic issues. And this is why the language of capitalism and socialism dominated. So the one side of the Cold War was led by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was primarily a Marxist inspired revolution, a Marxist version of socialism. It's not the only version of socialism. There have been quite a few versions kicking around in the 1800s, but that's the one that came to dominate in the 1900s. And because of Marxism's uniqueness, it emphasizes economics as the most important and foundational issue. And so its version of socialism says, first, we need to make people equal economically. And there are, of course, other social dimensions that matter: the status of the family, religion, the law, art, and so forth, but everything is first and foremost economically. And the contrast then economically to that kind of socialism is a free market form of capitalism. And so the Marxists were always attacking capitalism, which leaves individuals as self-responsible, free agents to do whatever they want in the economy. That, from the Marxist socialist perspective, was the bad boy. That was what they were attacking. So because that debate was the prominent debate of the 20th century, socialism and capitalism came to be the language that at least people of our generation used a lot and carries over into the new generation. But by and large, the capitalists won the debate in the 20th century. So what we have seen is the debate is shifting in the last generation and a half or so, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, the disasters in communist China, and the various terrors and horrors of smaller places like Cambodia and Cuba and so forth. So by and large, the capitalists won the debate. We should have some sort of free society, some sort of market-friendly society. And even many of the socialists have recognized, yes, that version of socialism that emphasizes economics as fundamental and is highly authoritarian is a disaster. Of course, there are still some true believers right out there, but they have largely abandoned the economic debate. And so what has happened is that the capitalism and socialism debate is shifting to other social dimensions. So now we're talking about the relations between the sexes and whether there are remnants of slavery. What about unequal treatment of races? And what about people of different sexualities and so forth? And so we're still having the same debate. Should we prioritize freedom fundamentally and let people go wherever they want? Or should we push a certain kind of equality fundamentally? And people who are socialists tend to still be egalitarian, and people who are capitalists tend to be people who orient freedom.
Do you think that there's that guilt has something to do with, because if you're guilty, then you're going to be thinking, I don't deserve what I have.
Yes.
Or you don't deserve what you have, or I don't deserve what I have. And so we have to equalize everything. And so
yes.
I think guilt has a lot to do with it.
Absolutely. I would say that's one of the arguments that's used from a certain perspective. Now, I think for the guilt argument to work, you need to add some other aspects of it. So if we say people should be free, well, who should be free? Are we talking about peoples as a collective? So, our group should be free from an external group oppressing us. The Greeks should be free from the Romans. Or is your unit of freedom the individual? So what you're saying is that individuals should be free. And then if you believe that individuals should be free, then there's a kind of justice conception that comes with that it's going to be your decisions, your actions that are going to determine where you end up with. Do you make $1 million? Do you go bankrupt? And so the individual gets what he or she deserves, following out of this notion of strong self-responsibility in a free society. But then the people who are unfriendly to that way of thinking, they have a kind of guilt argument. They will say, for example, that in the past, some individuals acquired, say, great wealth, not because they earned it in a free market, but because they exploited other people. And many of these charges are accurate. So there are some fortunes that were based on large-scale theft, some that were based on fraud, some that were based on slavery, and so forth. Now, if you then say the people who inherit any aspect of that wealth then are complicit in the original sin or the original bad action that led to that fortune, they do not deserve that portion of the wealth. And to the extent that they have that wealth, they should be feeling guilty about that wealth. Mm-hmm. So there we are shifting, though, from seeing wealth primarily as something that's acquired by individual effort and something that's acquired more by groups. So it was my family that, say, 300 years ago became rich, and I have inherited the wealth, but I've also inherited the guilt that comes with the inappropriate methods by which they acquired the guilt. So we also then have to talk not only about kind of liberalism versus egalitarianism or capitalism and socialism, but also individual responsibility versus collective responsibility. And almost always the guilt-inducing argument comes out of a more collectivistic framework. So we see, for example, on the debate over reparations for slavery. So one side wants to say, the people who were slave owners and who were the slaves, that was a terrible injustice in the past, but all of those individuals have died. And so the guilt, so to speak, and the victim status dies with the individuals who were involved in the action. So I can't be held responsible for the bad things that my great grandfather might have done, and also I can't claim victim status for bad things that happened to my great grandfather or great mother, say. And that's a more robustly individualistic understanding of moral responsibility. But the side that wants to say no, say white people as a group owe something to black people or Native Americans as a group, or men as a group owe something to women as a group, if they are then saying that the injustices that require the reparation involve people in the past, previous generations, then that's a more collectivizing, that you are not primarily a member or an individual responsible for your own actions. You are a member of a group, and that group has benefited from or suffered various things. So that individualism versus collectivism is very important as well.
Now, if I think, if someone is making that argument and defining as groups wage war on each other. Individuals have arguments or feuds even sometimes, but that's up to families usually. So that's even starting to be a group, is a feud. But wars are often, there aren't individual wars. It's groups of people who fight wars. So as soon as this is how it just seems to me, as soon as you start to define your point of view as a member of a group, then there is a possibility of large conflict, rather than just two individuals talking and working out what the problem is, So I can't see, well, and then the other thought I have is that as far as I can tell from the ethics that we are bound by or have been bound by in the Judeo-Christian philosophy, that's an individual responsibility that goes back to the Bible. Mm-hmm. But if you're starting to talk about groups, then that doesn't seem to me that it comes from a place of ethics that the United States and Canada were founded on. Mm. So that undermines actually where our foundation, does it not?
That's an interesting complex of I think like 2 paragraphs worth of thought there, right? Because we're working out very multi-dimensional issues, right? So certainly one question is going to be, how does this, say, issue of reparations, if we just take that as our example, in its modern form, which tends to emphasize racial groups versus or sexual / gender groups, right? That men owe things to women. Whites say owe things to other racial groups and so on, compare to other forms of collectivism and individualism, because none of those are explicitly religious, for example. But as you're pointing out quite correctly, there is a kind of notion of guilt that is inherited across the generations in the Judeo-Christian tradition as well. Mm-hmm. And it's not tied to gender or sex, and it's not tied to racial issues as well. So the label collectivity is a very broad label. And if you want to go down the group analysis, you do have the follow-up question of saying, well, what is the appropriate group? Is the right agent of moral responsibility? So you mentioned feuds, for example, which are often conducted at the family level. That can be a kind of collectivism, depending on what your understanding of the family is. So, if it's that, I'm just going to, your brother did something mean to my brother, right? But if I process that as, well, I'm part of my family and you're part of my family, now you and I, Tammy, we are enemies, as individuals. The reason then seems to be, it's not that you individually did anything or that I individually suffered a harm, but we're part of a family, and those collectives are now in conflict with each other. For others, the operative unit is not going to be the family, it's not going to be a racial group, it's not going to be a sex or gender group, it's going to be an ethnic group. So just because, say you are Irish, right, or you are German, or you are Korean or Japanese, I don't treat you primarily as an individual. Instead, I see you as a member of my ethnicity, or of an ethnicity group. And whether I see myself as in conflict with you or not is primarily driven by that form of collectivism. So what we would need to do then is drill down to each of the kinds of collectivism that are out there. Now, a similar thing happens on the individual side. If we then say, okay, we're going to say it's individual self-responsibility that's fundamental, and yes, I might choose to join various groups, religious groups or sports team groups. And often we see this tribal kind of collectivism playing out in sports psychology as well. Or it might be that I am born into certain groups. I am born into a family. I am born into, as a male, say in my case, and so forth. So the individualist side needs to work out how all of those other elements of who you are come to relate to your core individuality. What makes you an individual with your unique individual moral responsibility? Is it your capacity for individual agency? Is it your capacity for thinking for yourself and accepting ideas from your family or not? Is it a matter of your capacity for acting in the world or not acting in the world, and so taking responsibility for your action? Is it a matter of my unique personality, including my personality dimensions, some of which will be born to me, but some of them might be acquired and come out in the form of emotional reaction. So there's still a lot further work that needs to be done on the individualism side as well. Now, the historical question, though, this was your second paragraph about the founding, say, of the United States. And here, I think, obviously, there's a lot of controversy about the extent to which the Judeo-Christian roots of civilization contributed to the American founding, or more broadly, the Canadian founding and Western civilization's founding, and how much the Greco-Roman tradition contributed to it. And I think both sides have some good arguments. I think it is possible to overstate the Judeo-Christian elements and say that really those are the primary ones and the Greco-Roman ones are not very important. And the same thing on the other side. My view, we won't have time to get into this though, is that it was probably, setting aside the political issue, the cultural issues, about 2/3 Greco-Roman and 1/3 Judeo-Christian. And then how that gets translated into political terms, say, in the American founder, with the ideas of separations of power, checks and balances, individual rights, bills of rights, and all of the constitutional amendments, and so on. All of that requires a great deal more nuance. But yes, then to come to your final conclusion, to the extent that we have a completely non-religious kind of collectivism, and many of the socialists / egalitarians / neo-Marxists and so forth are coming out of a philosophical tradition that is both anti-Judeo-Christian and anti-Greco-Roman, right? So they're adopting a very different, a third philosophical framework that makes them alien to both. So then, crudely put, it's not really a two-way battle that we have, between Judeo-Christians and Greco-Romans. We have a kind of synthesis that we worked out in the early modern world, that what we call modern Western civilization involves that synthesis. But this third perspective is hostile to both. And so people who are advocates of a more secular, separation of church and state, individual rights, free market economy, and they're not particularly religious, but they love Western civilization, are the enemies, right, of that third socialist egalitarian group. And the same thing can be said of people who love, say, Western civilization, but in their hearts they're coming at it from a Judeo-Christian set of commitments. They also are the enemies. And so we really have like a three-way debate, and whether two of the three can work together or not, or whether they are all mutually hostile. That's a hard question. We're still arguing about that.
Mm-hmm. We definitely are arguing. There's no doubt about it. Oh, I wanted to talk about the difference between modernism and postmodernism. Because the reason I asked you to be on here is because I read your book, Explaining Postmodernism, which I read twice. The first time, the first part of the book, I kind of had a hard time understanding, and then it became clear at the end. This time, I got a better understanding of the entire narrative, but I'll have to probably read it again.
Thanks for reading it twice.
Well, I have no philosophical background. Yeah. I have a Bachelor of Science. I was a massage therapist through my life. I was interested in art and really biology and maybe some psychology, because you listen to your clients. Yeah. But I stayed away from feminism. I stayed away from, although I was interested in philosophy, I didn't study the arts, but I've come to realize that it's my responsibility to understand all of this in order to deal with the questions that we have these days that are very important in our society. So I can't let that rest anymore. So that's partly why I asked you here today, is because I need to, and I think my listeners need to also understand the philosophies that we are living with right now and where they've come from, and find some direction forward. So modernism and postmodernism.
No, I think your remarks are exactly on target. I mean, we have lots and lots of debates about cultural, political, right, and so on issues, but they are deeply philosophical, and necessarily we have to grapple with the philosophy in order to understand the positions. Also, just as human beings, we're smart people. We have this big brain, and necessarily we think about the important questions. What is the meaning of life? And we all, to have a thoughtful and actually successful life, need to have worked out answers. It's a long-term project, and you need a strategy. And philosophy is necessarily a part of that. Now, what makes it harder, though, is not only that the philosophy questions are very abstract, and we have all of these controversies about them, and they press our emotional buttons in a deep way once we get into them, and it's hard to think rationally about hard issues when you are emotionally worked out. But also that a lot of these positions do have historical roots, and in most cases, each of us is working within a philosophical tradition or living within a philosophical tradition, whether we realize it or not. We absorb it sometimes uncritically when we are kids. So unpacking all of that and making it explicit is important. Now, the same thing is true about these very broad labels, modern and postmodern. And the other part of the trilogy is going to be the pre-modern. So what we have now, when we call something postmodern, is an intellectual framework. And all of this wokeness and diversity, equity and inclusion, and political correctness, and even ESG in some forms, things that are in this penumbra of trendy labels, are broadly coming out of an intellectual framework that is postmodern. And it's postmodern because it's explicitly saying, its intellectuals and its strategies, that the modern world is a mistake, or that the core ideas and the core institutions of the modern world were false from the beginning, or when they were put into practice and we created this thing we call the modern world, they've led to negative results, pathologies, disasters. So what we need to do is take the entirety of that and move beyond it, move to the post. So then the question is, what do we mean by the modern world? Now, again, that's hard because we can talk about different domains. What do we mean by modern art or postmodern art or modern literary criticism and so on? But the way that most fundamentally this label is used is by historians and philosophers who will say that about 500 years ago, the world started to change, and it started to change dramatically. And in historic time, those changes were revolutionary and very quick. So that then means we need to think back about 500 years ago. So let's take the year 1500 as a somewhat arbitrary date. But start to think about what happened in the world in and around 1500, say just one generation straddling that date. Well, 1492, Columbus crosses the ocean. All right, and that's huge. So a new era of exploration, a new era of everybody basically in the world in a short period of time understanding that they are part of a much bigger world than they did before. And that changes how we think about the world. Also, around that same time, this is the era of Michelangelo and Leonardo in the art world. And of course, others, Botticelli and Raphael. So it's the high Renaissance in the arts. And this is also revolutionary in the art world. So just to take, for example, Michelangelo's David, the sculpture that we're all aware of, and to some extent, it's still a controversial sculpture. Now, this is, in one sense, a religious theme. It's David and Goliath, so it's the biblical story. But what we have, though, is Michelangelo choosing to portray David as a beautiful, idealized male figure in all of his natural glory. So if you contrast that to much of the art that was characteristic of the medieval era or the pre-modern world, which was almost exclusively focused on spiritual issues and de-emphasizing the body, suddenly nature and the body matter. And it's front and center. And rather than being ashamed of our bodies, we are celebrating the potential beauty and competence of the human body. So in the art world, we have this revolutionary transformation that's going on. We also have someone like Martin Luther in the 15-teens. So obviously human beings are religious. Europe is largely Catholic at this point, and there have been various kinds of reforming movements breaking out here and there. But suddenly there is a Reformation movement that occurs that is then successful. And part of the argument here is that we're not going to rely on this hierarchical institution that the church has become, setting aside the issue of corruptions within the church and so forth. The idea that we need to have indirect relationships to God through the hierarchy. Rather, this is a kind of individualism. Each individual should be able to read God's word for himself and then increasingly herself, because the care of your soul is an individual matter. It's not a social hierarchical matter. And so we're going to start doing religion over the course of the next centuries in a different way. So there's a Columbus, there's Michelangelo and Leonardo, and now Martin Luther. And so we have revolutions in world exploration, in the arts, in religion. It's also the generation of the early scientists. So Copernicus, for example, also 1500s, rather than some place, the earth is the center of everything, and God made the heavens and the earth. and the earth is at the center of his plans for everything, and mankind, his greatest creation, is supreme on the earth. Instead, we get the earth dislocated to being a satellite around the sun. And the reason why it's there may have something to do with God's plan, but it doesn't seem like it. Instead, we're starting to understand the world and our place in it just by observation and using instruments and using mathematics and statistics. And so there are revolutions occurring in the sciences. As well, we have Vesalius for the first time doing complete and thorough dissections of the human body and publishing his anatomical works. So the point of all of this is going to be that there's all of these revolutions in science, in religion, in art, right, going on, as well as there's the beginnings of some political movements. You start to see people resisting the hierarchical structure. You see a rehabilitation of the Greek notion of democracy, the Roman idea of having a republic. And so thinkers like Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes become very important in this century as well. And the then political revolutions that are going to come along. So this is the modern world. And suddenly we see ourselves doing naturalistic, humanistic art. We're doing science. We're seeing ourselves as part of a global economy, and that the individual matters. One of the very interesting things, it's kind of I think of as an unintended consequence of the Protestant Reformation, though, is this emphasis on if it's important for each individual to take care of his or her own soul, and the way that you need to do that is by reading God's word for yourself, then it becomes very important that all kids learn how to read. By the time the 1500s, it was perhaps 2 or 3% of the population that was literate, and that has huge social implications. But within a century or two after the Protestant Reformation, suddenly we are up to 50%, and then 60% and 70% of the population that can read in their own language. And that is going to have huge implications, obviously, for the publishing industry, but also the fact that when people start to read, they start to become a little more informed. They start to become rational, more rational. I know that's a controversial claim, but if you think about the way religious history goes, instead of simply accepting the authorized interpretation from on high in the hierarchy, if I read, say, scripture for myself and you read scripture for yourself, we start to talk about it. What's going to happen? Well, we're going to have disagreements. You're going to challenge my interpretation. I'm going to then hopefully be able to defend my interpretation, but I'm also going to challenge yours. So that's then going to spur our ability to reason in more sophisticated fashion and read in more sophisticated fashion. And if the idea then is that ultimately each individual needs to be the custodian of his or her own mind and his or her own soul, then that's going to have social implications. So we start then to say, well, look, we've been arguing about this for 5 hours. Let's just agree to live and let live, right? You're going to believe what you believe. I'm going to believe what I believe. Then we have the seeds of the notion of tolerance that start to come along. We also start to then, as we become more literate, realize that not all of the politicians are good guys, that very often they are using religion to try to manipulate us in various ways. And also religious leaders have been trying to use politics to manipulate us in various ways. And so we become more savvy, more alert to this. And then not only do we need to have tolerance, but maybe we need to get religion out of politics and politics out of religion. And so we have separation of church and state. So the idea is that all of this is going on in a very short period of time, a century or two in human history, until we get to the 1700s. And this is, I think of it as the intellectual, first intellectual height of modernity. We call it the Enlightenment, when suddenly there's revolutions in science and art and politics and economics, and the idea that also, look, people who are slaves, they're also individuals who have their own minds, who have their own souls. And there's something then morally wrong with slavery. And so for the first time in human history, in the 1700s, we have suddenly lots of people who are opposed to slavery. And they start to form societies that then in a very quick fashion push slavery into the background and in some cases abolish it and go to war in order to end slavery. And the same thing with respect to women. For the first time in the 1700s, women they have their own minds. They are the custodians of their own souls. They should be educated. They should have the freedom to run their own lives. And so the very first feminist movements come into existence in the 1700s and so on. So the idea then is that all of this is the modern world. But what it's based on fundamentally is this idea that we need to take understanding the natural world seriously, including human nature seriously. So we need to do science thoroughly and rationally, and that human beings have a big brain. They have reason. They can learn, sophisticated. They can become educated, and so they can become self-governing in all aspects of their lives. And as that works out, that commitment to naturalism and rationality and taking the individual as very fundamental, the modern world transforms itself into, I think, of this magnificent world that we are living in. Now, the postmoderns, though, want to say that all three of those points are wrong. They are against naturalism, they are against rationalism, and they are against individualism. And so this is where the important intellectuals of the postmodern world, and you may have heard of names like Michel Foucault, who's perhaps the most famous of them, a French philosopher of the mid-20th century, Jacques Derrida, Richard Rorty, an American, Jean-Francois Lyotard, right, and others. What makes them all postmodern is that all of them are very well educated. All of them are philosophers, actually, with PhDs in philosophy. And they have studied not only all of the important arguments in philosophy, but they have studied the history. And all of them are saying the modern world is based on false assumptions. And the most important of those false assumptions that they will, is this assumption that human beings are rational, that we can be reasonable, and that this reason is competent to govern our own lives as individuals or to come to know the external natural world, perhaps formally in the form of science. So they have come to agree with some of the very powerful skeptical arguments, negative skeptical arguments developed by philosophers about the power of reason. So, the argument that, science, for example, is based on observing the world. That's our foundation. Everything needs to be put to the empirical test. Look at the data. Well, they will buy into the arguments that our perceptual faculties are subjective. They're subject to illusions and hallucinations, and so they can't be a good foundation. Or all of the arguments about logic and math, for example. Well, those are just based on kind of arbitrary definitions that we have made up. They don't have anything to do with reality. So we don't have to accept your definitions. We don't have to accept your logic. There's just, white European logic and other kinds of logic. So there's male logic and female logic. So there's no universality there. Or even, you just remember a couple of years ago, we're having the debates about whether 2 + 2 = 4 or not, something so foundational as that. And all of the skeptical arguments coming out to say, well, no, that's, math was just made up by, white male Europeans, and it's used in science, and science is oppressive, so we're just going to dismiss that. So all of that anti-rationalism comes to be importantly part of the postmodern tradition. And what they are then grappling with is the idea is if we don't assume that human beings are rational, if we don't assume that reason is capable of knowing the world, what does this imply for how we live our lives, how we do our social lives? It's going to have important political implications, for example. If we think of our democratic and republican institutions, all of those are based on the one hand, a commitment to individualism. It's individuals who have rights, these inalienable rights. That there are some things that you just can't do to individuals, and it should always be forbidden. But also in terms of the procedures of democratic republics, the idea is that individuals matter fundamentally. that we're going to give every individual the vote. And if we think about what that assumes that individuals are capable of thinking about very complicated political matters. That you and I and other people, we can assess the evidence, we can assess the data, we can process, in some cases, huge amounts of data and come up with an understanding of various policies and consider policy alternatives, that we're going to have lots and lots of discussions and debates. And hopefully we're going to be open to changing our minds on so the idea is that individuals, we have this understanding that individuals are pretty savvy. And so we can do politics in a democratic fashion. And we're going to let the majority, for example, decide who has power. And of course, we will make mistakes, just as scientists make mistakes. And we will vote the wrong guys into power, but we will be able to learn from our mistakes as new evidence comes in. And as we continue to argue, we will change our minds. We'll vote those guys out. And about particular policies, we will put them to the test, again, like a political science experiment. And if it doesn't work, we will say, okay, that didn't work. We need to repeal that law and try something else. So if, though, we don't believe that individuals are rational and capable of doing all of that, then our politics has to look very differently. And all of the postmoderns say individuals are weak. Rationality is, we have very skeptical, relativized understanding of rationality. And that means we're going to have to do politics in a very different way, which is why all of the postmoderns are anti-democratic, anti-republican. And so we see they're not interested in debate. Instead, they're interested in calling you names. They are interested in trying to shut down on the speakers they disagree with rather than engaging in discussion with them. They are interested in canceling anybody who disagrees with them. And they don't see anybody really as individuals. When we are disagreeing with people, shutting people down, getting them canceled, it's because of their group membership. That's because you're the wrong race, you're the wrong gender, right? Or you're the wrong ethnicity. So they don't believe in rational individuals. Instead, they believe that we are non-rational members of groups. And that postmodern framework has become very well established initially in some circles in higher education, but then it colonized various other aspects of higher education and has now spilled out in, I guess, probably the last 8 to 10 years, most obviously into our political discourse and the way we are doing our other aspects of cultural debate.
That sounds like postmodernism. And so, I've read in some places that postmodernism was the most, people have written that postmodernism in the 80s and 90s was when the height of postmodernism. So are we in a different philosophical time now, would you say, rather than postmodernist?
No, I don't think so. Just because, I think that's right, that the postmodernism reached its height in the late 70s on into the 1980s. But that's to say it reached its height as an intellectual movement inside the academic world.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and I think it's true to say that postmodernism has not progressed as an intellectual movement over the course of then the last 30 years. So we're a generation past that. And I think the reasons for that are that postmodernism is a very negative movement about the possibility of objectivity and universality and individuality. But all of those extreme negative conclusions were reached in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there's not really anywhere to go after that, once you reach that negative point. So when you read journal articles or books written by postmodern intellectuals, written in 2005, 20 years later, there's nothing new there. And now almost 20 years later, I dip into the postmodern journals now. There's nothing new. It's the same arguments being recycled, right, over and over. So it's a stagnant intellectual movement. But what has happened, though, is that the intellectuals who initially were in philosophy departments kind of in the most abstract movements, then moved into history departments. And so the philosophically minded historians, the postmodern historians now then said, what does this mean for history? And then the same thing happened in anthropology. What does postmodernism as a philosophical framework mean for anthropology, for sociology, for then into the professional schools? What does it mean for education? You know, in the West, we've had this idea that education should treat each individual as unique, and that we're trying to develop his or her rational capacity. It needs to learn how to read and do mathematics and know a lot of facts about science and history and so on, to develop a very powerful individual mind so they can become a responsible citizen, say, in a democratic republic. But what does education for postmoderns mean if it's not anymore about facts and developing the child's capacity for reason, which means, literacy and mathematics skills don't really matter very much. We're doing something different. So you start to see postmodern philosophical arguments getting into education schools in the 90s on into the early 2000s. What does postmodernism mean for legal training? And so you start to see the philosophically minded legal theorists say, well, we have to abandon this idea of individual rights and civil procedure and all of those standards of evidence and argumentation and logic and counter-argument that comes out of the modern understanding of how law should be done. If all of that is false, if law is not based on really on any of that, it's based on members of groups that are mostly non-rational or irrational with their contending value commitments, and that's how we understand the law, then we need to recast the law. So the point is that postmodernism as a philosophical framework did not go anywhere over the next 30 years, but it did intellectually, but it did move into, or it colonized, to use the trendy language, the other important academic departments. Then that's happening in the 90s. It's happening in the first 10 years of the year 2000s. And then we have then a new generation of lawyers, a new generation of teachers, a new generation of historians, and then, of course, a new generation of politicians coming up who have been educated in a more postmodern framework. They're skeptical about all of the modern framework. And at that point, we reach then a cultural tipping point. It stops being an intellectual framework in philosophy. It stops even being a wide set of movements, more broadly speaking, in the academic world. Then we start to see it spilling out into culture. Our debates over law, over politics, over how we're going to do business. We haven't even talked about postmodernism in the business. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, DEI and all of these sorts of things as well. So it's then by the 2010s that we start to see the applied postmodernism in lots and lots of areas of culture. And then lots of people who are academics say they've been in their ivory tower just doing their own thing, stand up and say, wait, the university has transformed itself. And it seems like, many of my students now are going out and doing things in the world that I wouldn't necessarily approve of. But then also lots of sensitive, articulate people who are out in the other areas of culture, they're not academics, are recognizing that the cultural landscape is changing, and they're hearing about postmodernism as some sort of weird thing that academics have cooked up, and then people start to get up to speed on what's going on there. And that's where we have been for the last 8 to 10 years, I would say.
That's very, it's very interesting. Obviously, it takes a long time. I was just thinking of fashion and how fashion starts in, say, France or Italy, and 8 years later, it's in Zellers.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And we move on. Things obviously are moving a lot faster in the modern world.
Right.
It's a global intellectual culture, global other aspects of culture, and we have much better communication technology. So it used to be that intellectual movements might take 100 or 200 years to develop. Right? So then we're talking about the the Renaissance, for example, and that's a 200 or 300 year story, or the Reformation, which is like a 100 or 200 year story. Right? But now we're getting into, it's one generation, and we can see the effects.
So I wonder if that's the case. Well, now we're in the age of AI. All of a sudden, just this year, I guess we're in the age of AI, which we haven't really even touched upon yet, or even know where it will take us. And who knows what that'll do to the postmodernism, the idea of postmodernism. I guess we'll find out, won't we?
Well, it's an interesting set of issues. In one sense, AI is very much a part of the modernist project. Right? All of the technologies are developed by modern scientists, modern engineers, modern entrepreneurs, operating by and large in a liberal free market economy. So all of those tools that enable us to do all of these wonderful things would not happen on a postmodern framework. If you say really logic is just arbitrary, and science is just male imperialism, then you're not going to be logical and you're not going to do science, and so the whole project will collapse. But nonetheless, AI as a set of tools is very flexible, and it enables people to create all sorts of virtual realities. And when you get inside the virtual reality, you are freed up to be as irrational as you want, and you are insulated from the actual real world consequences of that in many cases. So the psychological and virtual social reality, I think all of that I can't predict.
Yes, but one of my questions was, how does narcissism and social media, those two things together, seem to be a perfect storm in today's culture war?
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had anything to comment on.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a psychologist.
No.
I'm sort of an educated person, and so I have some thoughts on this. I'll comment primarily, though, on the postmodern element of this. I think one of the reasons why we end up with narcissistic people and socially alienated people and a larger number of socially antagonistic people is due to postmodernism, not only due to postmodernism. But if you drink deeply from the well of postmodernism, for example, it necessarily leads you to a dark place psychologically, right? It tells you your senses do not put you in contact with the real world. You cannot trust your senses. Maybe you are living in the Matrix, if we remember that movie. It also tells you your mind is not competent to know reality, that you should not think of logic and mathematics and scientific method on complicated math as the way to figure out important truths of the world. And so to the extent you believe that, you will have a larger number of people who don't try to be logical, who don't learn math, who don't know anything about science. And that's going to put them in a profoundly uninformed, but also uncomfortable place, because they're going to feel they're living in this very complicated world and they don't have the tools to handle it cognitively. And so all of that sets you up for being in a dark place psychologically. Postmodern also teaches you that you are not really an individual with agency. You are a social construct. You have been made by, in many cases, made by dark, sinister forces who are manipulating your language, manipulating your value system, manipulating the economic system, manipulating the political system. And you are just this tiny fragment manipulated by these dark forces beyond your control. And that, again, sets you up for going into a dark psychological place.
That's kind of interesting, though, because if postmodernism is a dark philosophy, then there's a grain of truth in that, is that is what has been the blanket that's covered society over the last few decades.
It does become a self-fulfilling prophecy also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah, it also will teach you, to see yourself as a victim, not only cognitively in this sense, but also socially. That if you're not an individual, well, who am I? And there's a kind of void there. If that void gets filled by, well, you are just this kind of intersection point of your race, your ethnicity, your religion, this, that, and the other background, then you again inherit all of the histories of all of those different groups with all of their conflicts. And so you start to think of yourself as a member of a group in conflict with all of these other groups that are out there. And none of us have kind of reasonable civil discourse ways of resolving our differences. So what should I do in that world? Now, there's a fork in the road, I think, here. I think the way a lot of people react is to say, this is too much, and I'm just going to retreat into a kind of shell. I'm just going to block out as much of the world as is possible. It's too much. It's too hostile. I don't want to engage. And there will be then disengaged forms of narcissism that will come out. The other side of the fork in the road, though, is then to say, maybe I feel like I'm more of a fighter in some sense. Yes, the world is irrational. Yes, there are all of these dark, sinister forces. Yes, I am born into this constellation of group identities. For me to find any sort of significance in my life, I shouldn't retreat into a shell. Instead, I should just go out and do battle in this dark, nasty world on behalf of my group's values. And I will use any tactics and any methods, fair or foul, in that battle. And so you get a much more aggressive kind of narcissism, where I'm not at all interested in treating other people decently or as individuals. Instead, I just have my set of values, and I'm just going to socially aggressively try to impose them on you. And that's a different kind of narcissism as well.
It's interesting because I think the psychologists say that there's, I think, between 3 and 6% or 3 and 5% of people are narcissistic. But if, who knows if that can change? I don't know if that can change, but who knows if it can grow? And it seems like it's growing.
Yeah,
but
I think it's growing.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah. I think postmodernism is only one route to narcissism. Obviously, narcissism has been around long before postmodernism as a movement, and I'm not going to speculate on what other kind of biological and psychological things can lead people to be narcissists. My subset of narcissists are going to be people who are coming out of a highly intellectual background. So these are then going to be people who may have started off going to university and being relatively normal, decent human beings, but they get in with the wrong crowd, so to speak. They're only exposed to very negative, postmodern, skeptical, relativistic, adversarial, dark understandings. And then they come to believe it. And that changes their psychology. And so they become, pathological, or they talk themselves into a kind of pathology. So it would be an acquired narcissism in that case.
Yeah. And so I know one of my friend's sons went off to Queen's University to study, I think it was neurobiology or something, so it was something quite scientific, but he's been caught up in this culture war and believes now in his victimization, I guess. And she doesn't even talk to him anymore at this point in time. And so, this isn't something that I imagine he learned in his science classes. I wouldn't think so.
Sciences are still relatively healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
Yes.
You know what I've noticed in the art world is I've seen in the last month or two, I guess, I've seen paintings, portraits. These are probably old paintings, but they weren't in museums. Oh, I know. One was on a wall in a hotel, and then the other one is in a storage. My son just bought a commercial building, and some people had stored some things there, and I saw 2 paintings, and there's a paint blocking off the face in the portrait, and that this is what do you call it? It's an argument against the modern painting
So it was a kind
the
of
way that modern paintings were done, right? So they're
kind
also
of
sticking their
effacement or effacement of the person's face.
yeah, just one. It was like one paintbrush that's this big, just pulled across.
Yes. Yeah.
And I saw one in a hotel on a wall in the room. So this is something that's being sold as art. But it's what do you call it? Protest art, right? It's protest art. And then there's, of course, the protesters that are going into museums like the one that they went into and defaced a Monet in one of the museums. And they've been sticking their hands in the climate. Those are the climate people, right? For some reason, they're going into the museums. Now, what was that? That was, I wrote it down. Oh, yeah. Climate protesters throw paint and glue at a Monet painting in the Swedish museum. So.
No, these are profoundly nihilistic, right, individuals.
Yeah.
And they're engaging in destructive actions, and they are explicitly targeting things they know are beautiful. And the attempt is to destroy something that's beautiful. They know that they are targeting, as in the case of the brush across the face, the individual, because the most individual external manifestation of you is your face. We're all unique, and so to desire to deface someone is saying something about anti-individualism. And of course, they're doing it publicly. They're not just doing a self-portrait and defacing themselves. They are taking other people's products and that are beautiful, that require great expertise to be able to create them, and in a very public, showy fashion, destroying them. So it's a profoundly antisocial message that they are trying to get across. Now, there's lots of psychologically wrong things going on there, but clearly this is postmodern activism, because the idea that things are beautiful, it's not only a modern thing. There have been pre-modern and ancient understandings of beauty, but that beauty is possible, that beauty matters, that we should strive for beauty, that value orientation. If you come to believe that the world is ugly and nasty and empty, and that's in you psychologically, then any manifestation of beauty out there in the world just becomes unbearable to you, and you want to destroy it. And so it's almost always well-educated in this negative way, people who are engaging in those kinds of actions. Now, the art world, though, is very interesting because, in a way, I think it's a good hypothesis to say that the art world got to postmodernism about a century ago, maybe a little more than a century ago. So you start to see it, this breaking up and this anti-beauty, and the starting of effacing individuals and putting ugliness and meaninglessness out there in public fashion. Definitely by the time we get to the 19 teens. So with someone like Picasso, in his Cubist phrase, breaking up the canvas and introducing disorder and conflict as very fundamental. Or someone like Marcel Duchamp, with his famous urinal. He goes to the plumbing store, buys a urinal, and submits that as his great work of art. And he knows what he's doing. He's a very smart man, very well educated. He knows the history of art. He's actually a first-rate chess player. So he's making all kinds of moves in the artwork. But then the idea that in an art museum, which is to be a more sacred place, devoted to craftsmanship and striving for things that are beautiful and sublime, to say, I'm going to take this mass-produced thing, no artistic craftsmanship at all. There's thousands and thousands of them out there. And this is something, to put it bluntly, that men urinate on. And I'm going to put that in this sacred place, the museum, right? And people are going to say, what is he doing? He's going to introduce confusion, and it's kind of a little bit nasty and feel the other things that people feel, or that we want people to feel when they go into the art world. So all of that is a very nihilistic, anti-beauty, anti-craftsmanship, anti-sacredness of art statement. But already the art world was getting there about a century ago. And so one way of reading art history from then is to say it isn't really advanced on that. Instead, we're just seeing a lot of variations on those same themes for the last century or so.
That's what it looks like. I wonder, this is partly why I started this podcast, is that it seems that it's up to all of us to decide whether we're going to be for beauty or against beauty, whether we're going to be, for virtue or against virtue. And it isn't a given anymore. It's not a straightforward matter that you will just be taught what's virtuous, because that's not the case.
Very well said. And I agree entirely. It's, in our own minds, in our own souls, we know the choices we are making, what we are for and what we are against. I think fortunately, most of us were born in a modern world that had taken for granted certain norms of civility and tolerance, and provided people with lots of freedom and lots of resources to put together a good life in a relatively peaceful fashion. And that made it easier for most of us to absorb that culture and to pass it on to our children and become managers and leaders in our workplace. But yes, and the final thing you were saying, I think, is exactly right. We can't take that for granted anymore, because the intellectual culture has changed, and we ourselves are subject to anti-virtue, anti-civility, anti-beauty messages regularly. And also, to the extent that we have children and we want to raise our children, we can't just kind of put them out there in the culture and the culture is going to do its work for us or make our jobs a lot easier. We all do need to be much more informed and have much more backbone in standing up for the commitments that we have made. And in our heart of hearts, we'll know if we are really committed to the truth as we understand it, to virtue and the beautiful, right, or not. So we do have a cultural battle on our hands, and the more prominent one is as an individual, the more that battle is going to come to one's door. So courage and really knowing what you stand for is much more important now than, say, 2 generations ago.
Yeah, certainly that's true. And we're each born into a family that will be as informed or uninformed as it will be, and we don't have any choice in that. But we do have, once we're at least conscious, once we're 7 years old or so, we can start to inform our kids of what's right, what's better, and what's not better, and to try to work towards the good. And but it is up to us to decide that individually more. It isn't set up. It isn't just given to us anymore. Not the same way.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I think in the same way. I think humans, no matter their social context, how benevolent and encouraging it is or not, do always have that responsibility. But various social institutions like families and schools and so on can make that job more or less difficult. And unfortunately, we are living in one of the difficult times.
Yes, we are. But the thing to do, I think, is to have your community around you that you can trust, because you'll need them in times, and to support yourself and your family and your children. And that's the best way forward, is to try to put yourself in a situation where you have support and understanding, and somebody has your back, so that when you're making mistakes, they'll tell you the truth.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. That was a nice historical, philosophical journey.
Right, well, yeah, a pleasure talking with you on these very important issues. Yeah, so thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.